All right, Marcia, congratulations on being named a Legacy Scholar for National Association for Gifted Children. And I prepared a series of questions that I think will interest both the audience of teachers as well as young doctoral students, as well as your colleagues and friends. So some of these questions, I think are personal, and some of them relate to your childhood, some of them relate to your career. So let's get started. Tell us a little bit about your childhood. Were you a good student? Did you like school? What were your interests?
Before we start, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement. I want to note that Purdue University is built on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Potawatomi, Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware peoples. We owe them a historical debt for the place where we work and study, and I want to pay my respect to the elders and descendants who have stewarded these lands and waters since the beginning. Yeah, childhood. That's a fun question. I was a good student, but I wasn't compliant. So I went to school in the 70s when everything was dumbed down and you couldn't get less than a C because they didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And so school was really easy for me because when I started school, I was already reading and doing math. And so they sat me in a corner with books to read. And, my mother made some comment to me that she was a National Merit Scholar and was valedictorian and four-pointed, and she expected me to get a 4.0. And I didn't do that to my child, by the way. But so I did as little as possible to pull the A out. And it wasn't school. I either had really great teachers or really not great teachers. And it was never hard. And I think my talent was taking tests because I didn't have to read the text. I could listen to the conversation and pull an A out of the exam. And so probably my senior year, I had taken all the classes that the little high school where I went had to offer. So I was sitting in a basic foods class with a bunch of freshman boys, and it was in the 70s, so everybody had really long hair. And I watched this one kid pull one of the girls' hair out of the little round screw on the back of the chair, and he had captured a fly, and the fly was going zzz, 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 around and around, and I thought, I got to get out of here. And so I left mid-year, senior year, and I went to university. I went to the closest university because that's all I knew to do. And I started there as a sophomore because I took those CLEP exams, so they gave me 30 credits in entry, so I didn't have to take many general ed courses. And my high school was like, well, you can't leave, we'll lose aides. So if you leave, we're going to take honors away from you. You can't be valedictorian. And I'm like, okay, that's fine, because I'm already in college. And you think that they would maybe have supported that, that's a good thing, but it was really all about the funding. And somewhere about April, they called me and asked me to give the valedictory address. And I was not happy about that because they had already told me I wasn't going to be able to graduate. And so I wrote the one speech that was about how, they were wrong and all of this. And then I wrote the speech that the counselor told me to write. And I was ready to give the first speech. And then I looked out in the audience and I saw my grandparents and my parents. And I said, fellow students, we're gathered here today for this wonderful occasion to celebrate. And I didn't do the first speech, which I'm still glad I didn't.
So, but in reality, then you ended up going to not a super competitive college either. You went to the nearest college, correct?
I went to Western Michigan University and I attended bar 6 nights a week to pay for it. And I found out from one of my bar customers who was a recruiter for K College, which is a pretty elite small private school that's in the same town, that with my scores, I could have probably gone to K College for free, but I didn't know any of that. And my parents were not college graduates, so I always knew I had to go to college. But truthfully, then, I don't think I knew the difference between a community college and a four-year institution or an Ivy. I just knew I was supposed to go to college. So I went to Western Michigan University, which was about 25 miles away. And I was obnoxious enough at home that my mother told me I could stay in the dorm.
So, so many of us are first generation college students, and in so many ways it's impacted and affected our life and careers. And being a first generation college student, do you believe that had an impact on your later career? And that is that you were so supportive of young people that don't have opportunities and resources?
I do. I think about how serendipitous life is, and I was told not to be a teacher. I was supposed to go to medical school because I had high scores, and I really wanted to teach. I rode Arabian horses and showed competitively as a kid, and I taught kids how to ride. I had 25 students before I was 16 doing riding lessons, and I was kind of a born teacher. My grandmother had an associate's degree, and she taught elementary school in Arkansas. And I think watching her work with low-income youth, and we never had a lot. We had enough, but my parents weren't wealthy. They worked hard. And I think when I look at our field, what a poor job we do of identifying kids who come from poverty or kids who have dark skin. It does fuel what I do now, because I believe that there's talent across all areas of humanity. And I think, I wonder sometimes, like, what would happen if we lifted those kids up rather than every once in a while somebody makes it in spite of us, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, so much of what we've done collectively, school-wide enrichment, your Hope Scale, the work you're doing now with Indigenous people, I mean, that really kind of revolves right back to these experiences where we see so many young people with potential that don't end up making it. And it's interesting that you so directly connect these experiences to some of your childhood experiences as well, even going to a college. So, you were discouraged from being a teacher, but nevertheless, you persisted.
Here we go.
What ultimately led you to a career in education?
Chemistry. I got straight A's all the way through high school, and I was in a small rural high school, and I went to college, and it was the first time it was hard, and I had no skills to study, and I got a C barely. I had a professor who said, look left, look right, those two people are going to fail, good luck. And he was right. There were 27 of us in the class, and I tested into the advanced class despite not having had the background, and I washed test tubes to get a C. And I was like, wow, this is hard, and I want to teach. And so I changed my major to teaching. I got a science degree, and there's not anything really much more fun than a group of eighth graders. My daughter used to ask me when she was growing up, what's your favorite animal? And I would always tell her eighth grade girl, because they were hysterically funny.
So did you have an early teaching experience that influenced your interest in academically talented students? I mean, I know you yourself you were a very bright student, as you indicated, but there certainly must have been something in teaching and that changed your mind about what you wanted to do, because otherwise you probably would have ended up a superintendent of schools somewhere.
So my first teaching job was in Big Rapids, Michigan, and there's a college there, Ferris State University, and I had a lot of really bright kids, and they were bored out of their mind. It was my first year teaching. I taught earth science, physical science, life science, and mathematics to 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And they were bored, and there was some funding from the state, and they didn't know what to do with it. And so I started a science club and a science Olympiad team and a future problem solving team, and asked the kids basically, what do you guys want to do? And the first year we did science Olympiad, I had to talk 15 kids into doing it. Trust me, it'll be fun. And we went to state that year and had a great time. And the next year I had to have tryouts. And so it was really, I coached the equestrian team up there too, but it was really the energy from the students. And it was interesting because I didn't really believe, I mean, I would let them use, they could earn coupons in my class, and they could use those for their homework assignments as long as they could show proficiency on their, on their exams or lab reports. And so I just kind of went with what the kids liked to do. I didn't have words for it like curriculum compacting or any of that till I met you guys later, but that was, yeah, the students sparked my interest in they could do so much more. And I had one student in particular, She was a seventh grader at the time, and the principal came to me and said, she's going to skip eighth grade and go to high school, so we want you to teach her everything that you do in eighth grade. And I was like, no, we do labs, we do all kinds of things. He says, I'm not asking you. You have to do this. And so the student came in and she sat down across from me and she said, my name's Jenny, and I really don't want to stay here. I'm going to accelerate and go to high school. And she says, I've looked at what you do and I want to come every Wednesday and every Friday because those are your labs and your test days. So I want to make sure I know what you're doing. And I was like, okay. And that student kind of opened the door for me because she could do it. And I, at that point, wasn't even open-minded enough to say, well, maybe she could. And later she went on to West Point, and she was #1 as a freshman, militarily, academically, and physically. And her sport was swimming, and we didn't even have a swimming pool in Big Rapids. So she was really, truly extraordinary, but she showed me, that it could be done.
Yeah, it's so interesting that so many of us have a Jenny story. And then what was your next level of pursuit, like in knowledge, gifted education? I mean, at that point, you probably didn't even know there was a field out there because there wasn't probably as many articles or books written. What year was this?
It was in the Stone Age, back when they were inventing dirt, before the internet and Al Gore. It was I taught from 1983 to 87, and then I was an administrator for another 6 years. But 4 years of teaching in Big Rapids, and then I moved to Jackson, Michigan, and I taught a self-contained, because of the work I did in Big Rapids, I got the last job in Jackson, and it was a union state at that time, Michigan was, and it was the self-contained 6th grade gifted class. And those children had been self-contained since kindergarten. Some of them were politically gifted, who their parents were and all that, and it was like one giant, horrible, dysfunctional family, and nobody in the district wanted that job, which is why it was open. And I had a good time with the kids, but it taught me everything not to do with bright kids. And Jackson was my first experience with overt racism. I think it was covert growing up where I was, but we were such a small school, everybody knew and loved each other or hated each other. This was a big urban area, home of the world's largest walled prison. And there was literally a teacher's lounge where the black teachers ate and a teacher's lounge where the white teachers ate. And there was super, super lots of racial tension, and I didn't know which lounge to eat in. So I only stayed there 1 year. And then I was offered a position down in Coldwater, Michigan at Branch Intermediate School District as a regional administrator. And that's where I found out that I could do administration. I developed programs and worked with 28 schools and had a great time, but I didn't really love it. But their condition for taking the position at Branch ISD was that I get myself in my car and drive across the country to some institute in Connecticut called Confertute. And I'm like, man, I show horses. I got a life. I don't want to spend 2 weeks of my summer in Connecticut with a bunch of people I don't know. But I wanted the job. So I got in the car and I left in a thunderstorm and caught it in Connecticut. And really that was life-changing for me because I found people who were doing some of the things I were doing, but had more background in it, and it opened so many doors for me. I was just totally amazed. And you probably don't remember it, but I sent you a note afterwards and told you how great it was and said, those people in the shirts that were carrying boxes? I'm a good worker. Let me come back. So, you had a convert right away.
Great. Well, I think that, that's a very clear answer to part of your past, to what happened to you now. But just for a second, reflect a little bit also on your science education work. Do you think that made a difference in your career?
Well, because I had a background in science, and it was group science, I mean, I did everything from physics to biology to astronomy, and it taught me scientific method and inquiry. So back then, I think this is an insight I've thought a lot about. I was a science teacher. Now I'm a scientist. And there's a big difference. I can remember, thinking I knew more than I did, that I had the answers for the kids. And now I think I know less than ever because of, employing science. So I definitely think, and I think Purdue, let me in because of my background in science, but I'm not a science teacher anymore. I'm a scientist. So yeah, I think it did inform it.
You know, part of being selected for this legacy lecture and having your work recorded is to have you reflect a little bit on your own career. You're very well known for a number of different things. Your research on cluster grouping, the Hope Scale, your research on enrichment clusters that you did with Joe and me, and then of course your work on culturally diverse students. So what do you think when you look back at your career? And I realize you have a lot to look forward to as well, but what do you think are some of your most important contributions?
I think you named them. I mean, I think a lot of people would tie me to cluster grouping. I'm kind of over that. We're finishing up yet another grant on it, and I'm hoping somebody else will take up that torch. I think my contributions in terms of the Hope Scale and measuring how students perceive school compared to how their teachers teach, it has been an important contribution. We have an instrument repository where we share freely our work on instrumentation. The work I did at UConn with Bob Gable on my class activities, and later the Spock instrument, which measures students' perceptions of challenge, choice, interest, enjoyment, meaningfulness, self-efficacy, has informed a lot because it gives me a view of schools not just from the big people perspective, but from the little people perspective. But really, Sally, I'm always most excited about what I'm working on currently, you know? So I think the Hope Scale and then our recent report, Access Denied System Failure, which sort of opens up exactly how bad the underrepresentation is in our field, not as a shame on you perspective, but as a from here we need to move forward, what can we do, hold it accountable perspective is I think, and I'm hoping that others will also carry that forward, and maybe when NAGC does the State of the States, they'll look more closely at representation in low-income schools as well as regular schools and among races because it's important.
Yeah, this is kind of a follow-up question because I think it's important to note that you're also the director of one of the probably best known centers for gifted education in the world. And that's a center that you took over from John Feldhusen, and yet you have really engaged and enriched it in so many different ways. So maybe you can talk for just a few minutes about your role as a leader at GERI.
Well, you know, I had a really good model for how to run a center when I was at UConn, because I would argue that the UConn Center is equally or maybe even better well known, but it's really an honor. You know, when I look back at being a kid from a little small town in Paw Paw, Michigan, to, you know, directing a major research center at Purdue, I'm humbled. The center is a full service center because we have youth programs. We also have a licensure or certificate program, and then we have a doctoral program, which for me that's where I put a lot of my energies. You know, like last year we had students from 9 countries, maybe 10 if you count Texas. We had all these students, you know, we had 16 doc students. So it's been an interesting thing. We're in the middle right now of, at the university, talking about whether to use GRE scores for admission, for example. And I've got an article I'm working on that because I'm comparing completion, you know, based on those scores. But what I like about the way we do our center is much like I learned when I was at UConn, students come into Purdue and they pursue their interests kind of in a talent development model. So they'll write a prelim, which will be published, you know, and I gotta tell you, when Joe and you offered me the opportunity to do a doctorate, I didn't really even know how that worked. You know, I didn't know you could come and have somebody pay your tuition and you could live in Susan Baum's basement. You know, I lived in the bomb shelter. It was fabulous. I'm writing an article for her school right now. It's such a wonderful group, but to come out there and to do that opened so many doors for me, and I didn't even know those doors were available. So I feel part of my responsibility to the field is to pay that forward to my own students and make sure that they're well heeled and they understand how the process works. We have 2 students graduating right now. One's already got a job and the other one's about to get a job, I think. So that always makes me super, super happy. And it's a lot of fun to have a center and be able to be creative and work with, I get paid to work with some of the smartest people from around the world. What a privilege.
Yeah. So, you mentioned being a doctoral advisor, and I think, what do you enjoy most about that role? When you think back of the many doctoral students that have graduated, that you have directly been their doctoral advisors, is it the mentorship? What do you enjoy most?
It's the synergy. I think it's the best part of the job. Monday afternoons I have doctoral seminar. I look forward to it. We learn from each other because they pursue what they're interested in. I had a student develop a theory of wisdom last year, and study that and develop an instrument. So it's never boring because they're doing new things and they're really genuinely hardworking, dedicated, ethical people who are, I know, going to make the field better. So for me, I think that's the lifeblood of higher education is the doctoral program. And you certainly understand that because you've mentored so many of us and continue to do so, which is incredible.
It's been a privilege. And what do you believe at this point are some of the most important issues facing our field? And I think in particular, if you can comment a little bit on the work that you've done, particularly recently, the report that you just mentioned, and also some of the issues related to underrepresentation, that would be of, I think, very keen interest to a lot of our listeners.
Well, there's a couple of things that I think are facing the field. I actually think the field's at a crossroads. It's a point where we either grow or we die. We have had poor representation of brown and poor youth in our programs since the beginning of the field. And despite good work from many of our colleagues, those interventions don't seem to be implemented widely and the problem persists. Don Ambrose and I were talking yesterday because he guested in seminar, and we were talking about the idea of sterile certainty, which comes from a mathematician, where we in this country believe our measurement more than we believe our people. And so we believe that we can, for example, measure somebody's innate intelligence and that the test is somehow more certain than what we see with our own eyes. And so we've become reliant on oversimplification to qualify students for programs. And in doing so, we leave a lot of kids out who would benefit. And we have a new piece coming out that we wrote for an issue that that actually was not published by NAGC. And what we did was we looked at the 5 most commonly used group intelligence tests and the 5 most commonly used individual intelligence tests in the country to qualify kids for gifted services. And we looked at the psychometric properties and development of those tests. Who was in the sample? Did they look at invariance testing among the different racial groups and so forth? And we found in general not much. And our question is, if we use measures that at the beginning when they were developed yield disparate results to identify youth for gifted programs, and we use those at the backside because they weren't developed well for use with the groups we're using them on, and they yield disparate results at the backside, why are we so surprised? So, Joe's idea of a talent pool and multiple measures and multiple pathways, those sorts of things need to be seriously implemented. It shouldn't be, that's why we developed the Hope Scale, because it gives us another perspective. It gives us a teacher perspective. A test score might catch a student who's obnoxious, but a teacher might catch a student who doesn't test well. So I think it would be a really, and our organization doesn't have huge membership. We're too insular. We think we talk to ourselves. And when I was talking with Don yesterday, it was like, we always talk about we need to go out and present to them, other fields. But he was talking about bringing other fields to us. And I think that has such merit. It's turning it upside down. We have to have a broader appeal, and places that are now eliminating gifted programs because of lack of equity, need to understand that if we actually increase our services and serve more kids and maybe come at general education, with the pedagogy of gifted ed, that we can actually find and develop more talent rather than remediation, in kids who have fewer opportunities to learn. When I started at Purdue, our youth programs had about 2 to 3% of the kids would come on scholarship. I've done a lot of fundraising, and about a third of our kids now come on scholarship. We don't have a test score requirement. The kids are brilliant, and nobody knows which kids are on scholarship and which kids aren't. And that's one of my proudest accomplishments, is to be able to give opportunities in the summertime for enriched learning to kids who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it.
Yeah, it's the enrichment pedagogy, gifted education pedagogy that we've tried to build into school-wide enrichment model to affect general education. But I would agree with you that, our impact has been less than it should, particularly since I think Joe wrote his first article about underrepresentation in 1973.
Yes.
Still talking about it. So
I just cited it.
yeah, it is such an interesting dilemma. And really, in so many ways, we've got such an exciting, joyful pedagogy. It would seem to me as if there ought to have been better ways, even after both of us have spent so much of our lives working on this, to make an impact. But we persevere and we continue doing this. Do you think in some of the schoolwork that you've done now, do you think you can think of a time when you've learned something about impact, or you've learned something about, what seems to work best in working with reluctant teachers and administrators?
I think case study works best. We have a simulation that we use to try to, all I want to do when I work with teachers is open their minds. I just want them to leave the door open to believe that there is talent potential in children, and that you can't tell in third grade who is or who isn't going to live an impactful life. And so when we say we're sterilely certain, really, that this kid qualifies and this one doesn't, I think we're doing a disservice. So I think one-on-one conversations and building relationships, and it's super important to have a school leader or a leader in any area that believes in talent development. And I think the external pressures for education right now, I don't think people go into education to hurt children. I think most of them have good hearts and want to do well, but I think it's really difficult when what you're held to is a test score standard, and we're such a deficit thinking society to say, well, if you don't do well on this test, then we'll find out what you're weak at and we'll remediate you. And really what we ought to be doing is saying, what are your strengths and what are your interests, which is what drew me to gifted education, right? And do that with them.
So Marcia, you've touched a little bit on this with talking about some of the recent work that you're doing and stating some of your concerns about the future of our field. But when I ask you about, a rosier or more positive view of where you think gifted education could be, if we took a few detours or pathways in the kind of work you're suggesting, what do you see? What's that vision?
Well, I think it's totally doable. I mean, I have great hope for the field. Taking a look at, like the access denied report as a baseline, and then having the will to be more inclusive in the field, and maybe stop some of the uses of it as a tool of segregation, and to move forward. When I think about all the different cultural talent development perspectives, how enriching that will be if we move beyond something that's just sort of logical, mathematical, or verbal linguistic, or the type of schoolhouse giftedness that Joe would refer to, and we begin to include more people, problem solving and the challenges of the future are going to be solved by diverse thinking, not by convergent thinking. So I think as we work one school at a time, and maybe with the loosening of we can only decide if a school is doing well by how well the kids score on a test mentality, that if we get students involved in type 3s, in solving problems that have, they shouldn't have to be a Ph.D. working on their dissertation. the first time to create new knowledge. And I think we have models in that right now, Greta Thunberg in the world, that could shape and move schools forward. They just need the freedom to do that. I think that piece in the enrichment cluster book at the beginning called A Freedom to Teach is super important. And then, the second piece of it is attracting and retaining good quality, diverse teachers to the field of education, and then rewarding them for doing great work with kids. And maybe the next study I want to do is changing up summer programming from remedial to enriched, and see how that affects students' views of school. And if we can show evidence that when we do what kids are good at and what they're interested in and what they like, and we develop that, then they create more positive attitudes towards school and do better. I think that can fuel it. So I think the opportunities are great. We need to connect with other fields, and we need to move forward and stop making the same arguments. We need to think about diversity and think about inclusion and think about social justice and anti-racism, and look at our own work and how we talk about our participants, and really begin to create narrative that moves it forward. I think it's wide open, actually.
So you just brought back a memory that I have of one of our great big enrichment cluster studies where we had 80 students that were identified as special education students for behavioral problems. Do you remember?
I do.
We did the enrichment cluster.
Are you kidding? I showed up at UConn and I was said, do this. Yes, I remember.
You're here on a grant. Yeah, so we had these almost 80, over 80 students that were in huge elementary school, and none of them, actually, we just totally put them into enrichment clusters with all other students, and we had no behavioral problems when these students were able to choose something that they loved and they had an interest in once a week for, I think it was 8 weeks. So that was really an enormously exciting finding for us, and I think it says a lot about what we can do, just as you said.
Well, I always think about, like, when I was a senior in college, I had to take music for the classroom teacher, and I can hear every rock and roll music lyric note in my head, but I can't reproduce it. My mother made me take piano lessons for 8 years. I couldn't do it, and I always wondered, like, what if I had to sing my dissertation? I would not be sitting here today, and I'm serious. I learned more from that teacher. And he made us play an instrument and sing in front of the class, and it was the most humiliating thing I think I'd ever done. It took 2 shots of tequila to actually walk into that class and try it. And, and so if you're a student who's struggling with reading or math, and then you get put in remedial reading or math, and you get to do it slower and longer and louder with less qualified teachers in your weakest areas, is it any wonder we chase them out of school? And very few of us in adulthood are generalists. In fact, the more educated you become, the more specialized you become. So what's wrong with finding kids' talents early on and helping them develop that, rather than saying, well, but you're not reading on grade level? Let them hear it, because just because they don't read doesn't mean they can't understand. And I think we get hung up too much on what they can't do rather than what they can do. And you're right, those kids in that study, when they were doing what they could do, one kid wasn't even mainstreamable, but he was fabulous in the art cluster. Absolutely.
So I'm going to detour for just a second. You're sitting in your beautiful home. You have a birthday coming up this coming weekend, and you're surrounded by art, and you're wearing art, actually. So maybe just one personal question. You've spent a good bit of your life supporting Native American artists, and with people, with the carpets that you've bought, with the weavings that you've bought. Maybe you want to just tell everybody that's looking at the beautiful art in your home a little bit about your passion for support for the arts.
I collect a very, very narrow area. I am fascinated by the women and some men on the Navajo Nation who weave. It's like painting with wool, and I buy contemporary weavings because the amount of work and the beauty in that art to sustain themselves on the res is amazing. I've been doing it for 25 years or so. I actually have them in a trust to go to a museum. But I've made good connections. I had Anne Gray finished her PhD. She's Bilagana, meaning white, but married to a Dene man and has 4 Dene children. And they're all grown now. But Anne actually defended during COVID. I graduated 6 PhDs during COVID. But during COVID, she defended her dissertation, and this comes back to my art and collection, from the backseat of a Ford Explorer at a laundromat on the reservation, because there's no connectivity. And so when I go there and I see the beauty and then the harshness and the fact that the reservation was drawn along the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon, but not to include that, and that the rates of uterine cancer are huge because of the uranium mines and the uranium in the water and the abject erasure of indigenous people from our culture. And then in our research field, we say, well, there aren't enough of them, so we exclude them from our studies. So it's all kind of a symbiosis, but I absolutely love to go to an auction, and I have relationships with several of the weavers, and I have a loosely cataloged collection, and I like jewelry too, but I really do love the weavings. So yeah, there's, and I know who wove each one of them and all that, and yeah, it's good to do things like that.
Yeah, I just thought I would mention your support for talent development, and many of these are poor women that you have helped support. So I think that's an important component of your life that it's nice to chat about too. Now, so you are a mother, you're a partner, you're a researcher, you're a scholar. We've talked a lot about your accomplishments in terms of your professional life. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have?
I'll maybe end with just talking about the importance of mentorship and sponsorship. I have great colleagues and great friends in this field, but none of that would have been possible without you and Joe and Bob Gable and Steve Owen and the family at UConn. And like I said earlier, I really didn't know any of that was possible. I mean, Sue Baum is a de facto advisor. And for you, what you taught me is that it doesn't end with graduation. That there's a friendship and a sponsorship and a relationship that develops. And, I always feel free to pick up the phone and say, hey, what do you think about? And to have that as a model, and I hope I'm able to do that for my own students. It's super important. And when students are looking for a PhD, my first question is why? My second question is, what is your interest area? And then my advice is, you have to find somebody who will care about you and somebody who can help you navigate the career and the waters, especially in academe and in the academy. And you also have to be able to respond to feedback. And those sorts of things make for really successful careers, and work collaboratively. And you've been just an incredible model. And I don't want to, I had good mentors all the way up, from my grandmother to my parents to, the superintendents where I worked. And I think that's a mindset that you say, what can I learn from this situation? So, just thank you for opening those doors. Yes.
I am incredibly proud of you. We are incredibly proud of you. You've made an enormous difference in the lives of so many students and so many young people and graduate students. And congratulations on this honor, and also on all of the work that you've finished and accomplished. And there's more left to be done. So thank you, Marcia, for this interview and for all you've done. And thanks to all of you who will watch this and get a chance to interact with Marcia a little bit at NAGC and learn more about her incredible life and the work that she's done. We're so very, very pleased that you're able to do this today. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.